We're going to talk you through this framework that we've been working on for meaningful communication of insights from data. A lot of this came out of one of the more depressing conversations I've ever had in my professional life. I was talking with a colleague who I respect a lot, who had done a lot of research on hog waste ponds in eastern North Carolina. So manure that goes into these ponds, and when a hurricane comes through, they get overflowed and they put toxic sludge into the water table around them. And it's a challenging problem in part because it's hard to get people to listen about that problem. And so my colleague thought that he had published on it and people didn't listen, and that was the end of his duty. And I kind of disagree with that. It disturbs me in part because my background was as an Air Force crash investigator. So we would go into a mishap that happened with an airplane, and finding out what went wrong was only a small part of the problem. The real job was to find out how to make that never happen again. And that was communication. The job was to make that checklist step that ensured that nobody would ever repeat that particular mishap ever again, and to get that to every aircrew member ever to fly that airplane anywhere ever again. So that communication piece is a critical element. And I think sometimes in the world of data science and communication, and any kind of communication, we miss that. Sometimes we miss it in education. So we built this framework to try to help make something that we can kind of get a toehold on in that realm. What we're calling it right now is data straws. And data straws are really just about making your communication kind of fit to the attentional bandwidth of the audience that you're trying to reach. So we kind of break that up into 4 elements. We begin by thinking about mission and ethics for the project. And then we go into scoping the communication, not from an engineering back-end perspective, but from the perspective of how much attention your audience is willing to give you when they first engage with what you're trying to say. Then we talk about engaging the audience, keeping their attention while you try to communicate what you need to communicate. And then in the end, a call to action. Once you've given them the insight that you think they need, how do you make sure that that lands with them and they take the action that you think that they should? One of the interesting things as we started to develop this is that I had a couple of conversations with my good friend, Rob Martin, who is a really gifted musician. And Rob said something that really stuck with me, that kind of paralleled. He said that most people think that they really like the electric guitar in a piece of music, the lead guitar. But a lot of what they like is actually the pocket that the rest of the piece of music makes for the lead guitar. And so I kind of think about this data straw in that framework. And we're going to use one of Rob's pieces of music to illustrate that, in part sort of experimenting on you as an audience to see if this helps you remember the thing that we're talking about moving down the road. We're going to talk about it through the lens of this project that Cameron and I started about a year ago. It was the beginning of COVID. My co-founder and I had just found out that we weren't going to get to go pitch at South by Southwest because it got canceled because of COVID. And all of a sudden, knowing all these people in Texas that I cared about, I saw this news story from the Lieutenant Governor of Texas talking about sacrificing people for the economy and not taking the safety precautions that could be taken to slow the spread. So it occurred to me, one, how do they know how much COVID is near them and what the threat is on a local basis to make their individual decisions? And 2, how do we spread that around so that everybody knows? So I started talking to Cameron and prototyping immediately. And we're going to talk through the process of how that came together. The first step of this framework, the first step of our process, was to think about the mission and the ethics of building a digital platform to help people get more information to make an informed choice about distancing measures and measures to stop the spread. And so when you think about mission and ethics in a project like this, I want you to think about the drumbeat that kind of lies under the piece of any piece of music and really drives the rest of the band to stay in tune. So that mission and ethics component is going to be a part of everything moving forward from the very beginning. And when we think about mission and ethics, we break it down like this. The mission first, what outcome do you want? For us, with what became COVID commitment, what we wanted was to be able to show people the way that their community was being impacted by COVID in real time to help them make the decision to adhere to CDC guidelines and to try to stop or slow the spread. A lot of this had to do with the fact that both Cameron and I have younger sisters working in hospitals on the front lines. In that early phase when hospitals were getting overwhelmed and PPE was in short supply, this was a really particularly big deal. When we start to think about the ethics, what we think about is 4 basic questions. And the first of them is, who is not in the room while we're designing this thing? It's easy for people who think the same and look the same and have the same backgrounds to miss things in the design of a piece of communication. And so that's something that you have to mitigate and manage through asking other people who are not from the spot in the lens that you're from. A good example of that is about midway through the second dev cycle of the project. We asked Cameron's sister, Isabel, what she thought of the visualization that we were making. And if you know me, you know how badly this particular critique stings. But what she said was that it looked like I had selected the default colors from a Microsoft Excel graph, and she was right. And we had to fix that. So we did, but it's about talking to people who have different sets of skills and different sets of perspectives. Third question, and this is one that kind of gets you up to 30,000 feet and helps you look down on a project through a very different lens, is how would you feel if your mom were a member of the group most disadvantaged by the thing that you're about to build? So what could go wrong? Who isn't getting the information or getting the wrong information? All the kind of unintended consequences that could happen. And that just helps you catch some things. And then finally, what is it that you haven't asked that you should have? All those unintended consequences. What else? What's the kind of off the wall thing that if we address it early can stop problems from occurring later in the cycle? The next thing after we got through the mission and ethics was to think through the attentional bandwidth that an audience member might be bringing to us. How much time and attention can we get from somebody to tell them about what's happening with COVID near them? When you think of this, I want you to think about adding the bass line over the top of the drum beat in a piece of music. We're just giving kind of a melodic hook for the rest of the band to connect to. So it sounds a little bit like this. So with this, we're starting to think about the challenges that we're seeing in COVID communication around the country. Now, I want to say up front that Johns Hopkins CSSE is an unbelievable organization, and it's their data that facilitated our work. But this is their dashboard. And looking at the dashboard, it's often challenging to look at a lot of maps of big red splotches and figure out what that means to you where you are. And so my main concern early in COVID, and really to this day, is what's happening at my parents' house. And it's difficult to infer that from this. So we thought about, if people are getting tired of big red splotch maps, how do we take just a fraction of the time and attention that they might be willing to give and get them to that kind of home element faster? The magic thing about a map is that almost anywhere, anybody in the world, when you put a map in front of them, their eyes go home. And so you have this immediate emotional connection between the data that you're trying to present and this person's home and their family and the things they care the most about. And so in thinking about that, I remembered this DataViz Today podcast that I'd listened to a long time ago with Ali Torben, where she had interviewed a researcher who made this poster with isochrones. Isochrones are geographic polygons of the places you could drive from a point in a given amount of time. So he did this for cities in Europe. And I thought to myself, if I had an isochrone for an individual person and I could roughly measure the number of COVID infections and deaths near them, I could tell them something about the threat near them and to their families that is different from the giant splotch map. So I started experimenting with isochrones, used an API called Open Route Service, and later we backed that up with another service as well. But just this ability to have somebody input their address or their zip code or any geographic point and get, instead of data about their county, data about what's within an hour of them. It's a much more human-centered way to present information, to me anyway. The next element, after we had kind of the raw format of the information that we wanted to present and that attentional pipeline established, was to try to engage users, to keep their attention once we have it. And so when you think about that from a musical perspective, I want you to kind of think about adding the rhythm section to a piece of music. You get something that has a little bit more movement to it, and it sounds like this. So we're not taking away anything. We still have all of those previous elements, the drum beat of the mission and ethics, the baseline of the scope, and now we've got this melodic element that you could almost dance to. We're getting close to adding that final element. And Cameron's going to talk us through some of the engineering that he went through to work with user engagement in what became COVID commitment.
So something that's easy to forget when you see a project in its final stage is that it didn't start that way. Big ideas don't start fully formed, or at least mine don't. Just as trees don't start from the ground 50 feet tall, they start as saplings. Ideas are the same way. So I have a framework that I've used across a couple different side projects for nurturing an idea and taking it through different stages of focus, which I got from a computer scientist. And it goes like this. You want to make it run, you want to make it right, and then you think about making it fast. And I'll talk you through how we applied this process to COVID commitment. Next slide. So Alex shared with us a screenshot of the simplest possible version of our idea. And that was some code written in Python inside a Jupyter notebook. This is a way to mix graphs and Python code next to each other. And it convinced us that we had a graphic that people would be interested to see. The downside is that in order for someone to repeat this analysis, they would need to know Python and have it installed on their computer. And we wanted to help people who are not necessarily data scientists or developers. So the next stage, tab, was to make this process repeatable, not just for one city in Texas, but to make this work for all of Texas. So we used data from the Texas Health Department and we turned it into a website. The next logical step after this was to try and repeat this process to work for anywhere inside the United States. So we changed our data set from the Texas Health Department to the Johns Hopkins data, and then we changed the New York Times data set because of how it handled counties and zip codes a little bit differently. At this point, we had Google Analytics in the site, and we noticed we had visitors coming from international sources. So the last tap was to extend our website to provide data for geographies outside the United States. And now we went from a visual analysis that was only available to data scientists interested in one city in Texas to something available to anybody with a phone or a computer anywhere in the world. So that was our core. So once we had that core in place, the next thing was thinking about what would make this a fuller experience. And we went through over 30 different iterations. I wish we had taken screenshots of them all, but one of the big milestones was doing a round of mobile polish. So this was how it looked early days on mobile. Some of the padding is messed up, the font sizes are irregular, but so we did a round of iteration to make it look better on mobile. Next, we wanted to be able to communicate with the site with people who weren't necessarily looking to read that much. So we added a video, we added pictures explaining what the project was about. We added some numbers showing you how many other people were also looking at the site so people would get a little sense of community. We added some call to action buttons to give people something to do after they had looked at our graphic. And lastly, so one of the people that we shared our project with was the Dean of the Yale School of Public Health, Sten Vermund. And he offered a piece of feedback that it might be useful for people to be able to see the trends in how much COVID was near them and see how that changed over time. Now, this was something we didn't do at first because it's more expensive to do, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of how long it takes to load the page. And we really didn't want people to leave the website because it was taking too long to load. So when we added this feature, we made sure it loaded only after the map had arrived so that people could still get the core isochrone experience and only consider the trends if that became relevant to them later on. Next slide. So this next section has a couple different parts to it, but it's inspired by a lot of technical work that goes on in the world of e-commerce, where they're extremely concerned about every single additional millisecond of latency, so that's waiting time, and its impact on how many sales will happen. Now, from our perspective, we weren't trying to sell anything, but we were concerned that people might visit the website and not find out about how much COVID was near them because there was a loading spinner happening for too long. So there are a number of steps that we took to make sure that slow response time wasn't hurting our credibility. So our Jupyter script was doing quite a few different things. And some of these things involved talking to services that we had no control over. Like if Google went down, if Open Root service was taking a long time to return, we would be impacted. And all of these different steps that were happening inside our data pipeline were contributing to these 5 seconds. So I'll take you through a couple of the measures that we took to bring that time down. So one of the big decisions was to address this question of provisioning. If you've ever visited a website and a banner came up saying we have too many visitors, our servers are overloaded, you've encountered this provisioning problem. Like a store that has a limited number of cashiers and suddenly has a rush of visitors, like on Black Friday or a big sale. This just means that there aren't enough resources available to serve the information. And in those situations, you have to, on the spot, order more computers. We didn't want to have to deal with that. So Serverless infrastructure is a way of writing your programs in such a way that you only get additional computing resources on demand, so that when you have more visitors, somebody else takes care of the process of getting more computers so that you only have to deal with your core business logic. And if you have fewer than 1 million requests per month, which comes out to about 1 visitor every 2 seconds, you can actually do this for free using the Lambda function architecture from Amazon. So this enabled us to not ever have to worry about needing to rent more computers when we had more visitors. Next slide. So another measure that we took was to cache as much as we could. Caching refers to the process of taking results that you've run before and reusing them instead of doing repeat work. Now, this may sound very good, and you may wonder why you don't just cache everything. Well, there's an adage in computer science saying that there are 2 hard problems, naming things and cache invalidation. Cache invalidation deals with the concern of you've saved an old result and you serve it to a future visitor, but it's no longer relevant. For example, you serve yesterday's counts today. So the tricky thing in cache invalidation is caching things only at the frequency at which they're updated. To give you a concrete example, the counties that are in a 60-minute driving radius of some location, that doesn't change from day to day. That might change from year to year if county boundaries are redrawn, but we weren't worrying about that yet. In contrast, the death counts per county, that's changing every single day. So we keep our isochrone shapes for a whole year, but we bust the cache for the county counts every single day. And that's how we avoided repeating work. And the last major area that I'll take us through is thinking about, when we talk about making things faster, there's actually a difference between making things feel faster versus making things actually faster. And the thing that's actually more important is how fast things feel. If you're on a page and it just appears to be frozen and nothing is happening, you might get frustrated and leave. But if you see blinking or a loading spinner or a progress bar, you get a sense that things are happening and you might have more patience. And so you'll see in a demo that's coming up soon, some of the interactions and animations that we put in place to put users' mind at ease that work is happening and that I'm not going to give up on the page just because we're trying to get results from something that hasn't been cached yet. There are a couple other things that we won't have time to go in depth into, but I'll just mention them briefly in case people are curious later. We did some things with code splitting, which is the process of not loading code for things that you can't see yet and only bringing them in later. There was this process of server-side rendering, which deals with taking any work that might be done on your phone or your desktop and moving it to our servers so that you don't have to do as much work when you have loaded the page. But when all of these things came together, we were able to bring the load time down by over a factor of 10, from over 5 seconds to under half a second.
All right, so here we are in the process. Cameron has just set up this system that keeps people's attention, and we've got them on the page. We've shown them what we wanted to show them, and we've developed this Rob Martin pocket for the lead guitar or in music, or for a call to action in a piece of data communication. So I want you to think, when you think of this step, of that final addition to a piece of music where you get the whole thing. So we've got the whole thing together now, almost, but we've got to get that call to action. And so in this case, we've done all this work. We think we're done, but we're also just smart enough to know that we ought to ask somebody smarter than us about how this is going to affect humans. So I am lucky enough to have a very close friend who works in Dan Ariely's lab, the Center for Advanced Hindsight, and was able to put us into contact to put this thing in front of Dan, who's a famous behavioral scientist, and say, hey, we have this lovetexans.org thing. We show them this information, and at the end, we want to ask them to be responsible. And Dan said something to the effect of, cool story, bro, but you got to be more specific about what you're asking. And so what he came up with is a pretty standard thing for behavioral scientists that was a little bit new to us, a commitment device. A commitment device can be a bunch of different things. You know, in the worst case scenario, a commitment device can be deciding not to cut your COVID mullet until you're done with your dissertation. I would not advise that kind of commitment device. But for us, it turned into a simple card where you could ask people to take the CDC's recommended steps to limit the spread of the disease, but also we added on another step just to ask people to maintain their social contact while we're physically distancing to try to keep mental health going okay. So we built that in. And the site went from being lovetexans.org to covidcommitment.org. And that's kind of the last piece of music that we had to add into this project. Once we built that out, we were pretty fortunate. The design continued to evolve. We got feedback from a lot more people than I can list right now. But the end product looks very different from what we envisioned at the beginning, and that's a good thing. We were lucky to have Dan take the COVID commitment and share it with his entire global Twitter network. The dean of the Yale School of Public Health plugged us on the Today Show. We ended up getting 850 plus COVID commits, which isn't a giant number, but we're proud of it, and 45,000 unique users from around the world. So it's a pretty good ending for us. A thing that you need to know about Cameron, though, is that when Cameron talks you through the interaction design, he's being a little bit humble and he's not really talking about all that he did as an interaction engineer. So like when I met Cameron, he was a 20-year-old sophomore at Yale. And the first conversation that I had with him was about how he had done this in-depth analysis of all of the Nobel Prize winners in physics. And his conclusion was that the thing they all had in common was that they had found a way to play with the subject that they eventually made into their Nobel winning work. So one guy had figured out how to use the magnetism of water in the body of frogs to levitate them. So just a pretty deep conversation to have with a 20-year-old kid. And I grew up on a dirt road in Maine and had spent the last 10 years boring holes in the sky in Air Force airplanes over Iraq and Afghanistan. So this was just a different kind of conversation. And it let me know that this is somebody who approaches things and plays with ideas in a way that's really unique. So I'm going to walk you through COVID commitment and some of the elements that Cameron brought in to keep people engaged and to get this message across in just little tiny ways. So when we load this page, first of all, you see the actual commit number spinning. It's just an automated thing. It's not actually changing, but it grabs your attention. Hey, this thing is alive. Pay attention. You see this cursor blinking. Look at me, I'm discoverable. This is where you put in your information. If you miss that and you want to go mess with the map is just a picture, but we have a pop-up guiding you back up to where we want you to be. And you can look up, for example, your hometown. So I get to know really instantaneously how things are going, where my parents are. I believe my dad is in the audience right now. And so it's nice to be able to remind him, hey, Dad, in the last 7 days, there's been a new spike in Bangor. So keep your mask on, stay safe. You're able to kind of sift down through this and see the isochrone that this is based on, the counties that it intersects with, and additional data. You can hover over and see the way that things went over time. So you can see that kind of post-Christmas spike and more detail if you want it. But in the end, we try to drive you down into the commitment. And this is where Cameron really kind of shines. There are all these little tiny details that you wouldn't really think about, but when you hover over, they change color. These little boxes are wiggling at you. I would never have thought of that, but it grabs people's attention and people get really excited in a way I wouldn't have expected when they click on them and little confetti things happen. Not a thing I would have thought of, but this to me is really good interaction engineering. And then when we get you to make the commit, just maybe we'll get you to share it out to other people and grow this thing out into the world. So to me, this is not necessarily a perfect framework, but it is a method of bringing together a lot of different elements and approaching an informational problem in a regimented way that we think is helpful when trying to drive home data insights to a general audience. So just in kind of summation, the data straw breaks down into mission and ethics, scoping the communications to the user that you're trying to reach, engaging the audience in a call to action. And you can think about that like the components of a piece of music, building the pocket for that call to action in the end to be as impactful as it can be. We're going to open up to questions now. There's always kind of that awkward pause where people figure out what they want to ask. While we're going through that awkward pause, I see we've got a question from my buddy Tarang. We'll address that in a minute. Everybody else, take a guess right now how COVID infections are trending near you this week. Maybe go take a look at covidcommitment.org and see what's actually happening. I think it's still a valid tool while we wait for vaccines to make it all the way through. The threat is still out there. So this is still, I think, a valid tool. Tarang asked how we determined if the 1 hour drive time was the appropriate radius. And the fact here is that we were a little bit limited by the data. So what we're doing in this calculation is taking all of the counties in the country that Hopkins collects data for and drawing an isochrone, and any of the counties that that isochrone intersects become a part of the data set. So if we do smaller than an hour, unfortunately, for most of the country, we don't have data fidelity smaller than a county. We can't get to zip code. So this was just something that was human relatable, but that also gave us more than just the county that you're in. And there's room to argue that more experimentation would yield a different distance. And I think that experimentation is part of the fun of a project like this. Another thing I kind of want us to work through in the little bit of time that we have is to think through how we might apply this data straw concept to the process of getting people to vaccination appointments. That is a technical challenge right now. We happen to have Cameron with us, who is an expert on this problem and has been working with a different team, NYCvaccinelist.com, and has worked through some of this. But I wonder if we as a group could talk through each of these steps and what we think, and then maybe talk through what Cameron and his team have done. So awkward pause. Type into the chat room what you think is a good mission statement if we're trying to get people to vaccine appointments without having to refresh all the time. I've got a question here. Absolutely. So if you go into the about page of covidcommitment.org, there are hyperlinks to all the different tools that we used. I would also recommend that episode of my favorite podcast, episode 20 from July 2018 of Data Viz Today. Ali Torban does a great job talking through Isochrons. And it's just a really engaging way. That podcast is great in general because she finds ways to make these data visualizations not only something that you can listen about rather than being able to see, but also talking through all of the guts of them and how they came together. So I think that's a pretty good spot to go to. We'll post a link to that in the chat room as well.
I'll also mention that we used Open Root Service initially, but at one point we were getting rate limited, and so we needed a backup isochrone service. And so we found out Mapbox also offers isochrones. The shapes are a little bit different than the ones from Open Root Service. You may notice that an isochrone is not perfectly circular, and that's because it's affected by the data that each provider has about what the speed limit is, or the specific streets that are available for any given point. So isochrone data may vary slightly from provider to provider, but they're usually pretty similar.
Okay, so I think it's a little bit challenging to try to do the chat room thing, to go through each of these steps for the vaccination appointment thing. So maybe Cameron, if you can walk us through the way that you approach this, and we'll just have people continue to post questions and suggestions as you walk through.
Sounds great. So starting with the framing of the first question, what is the mission behind building something related to vaccine appointments? We can take a look at the next slide, actually. The problem is that everybody wants to get a shot, and you have to go to a lot of different places to be able to find appointment availability. What's the problem with this? If somebody doesn't know all of the websites, if somebody doesn't have time to visit all of the websites, they're not going to get a shot. And not only that, if someone gets stressed enough through this whole process, they may give up and not get vaccinated. And we don't want that to happen. Actually, I see we have a question in the chat.
Yep. Lindsay Gavin is asking why we display raw numbers rather than normalized by population. That was actually a thing that Lindsay and I debated back and forth quite a bit in the early stages. I think with a thing like this, so one of the ideas that my dad has always kind of tried to drill into me since, I don't know, before high school, is that when you can say something in a way that a smart third grader would understand it, you can reach the majority of the population. And so when you can distill your communication down into something visceral that people have a feel for, you've got a better shot at getting across what you're trying to get across. So raw numbers, to me, are a little bbit more relatable to a broader segment of the population than saying, hey, for every 100,000 people X number are going to have this, because I don't know 100,000 people. So the math, while I understand it from a scientific perspective, isn't always as effective in terms of trying to give somebody a visceral feel for what's going on near them. So let's drill back in on the vaccine list kind of problem statement, and keep throwing questions. I like the interaction a lot. I appreciate it. Similar question. Yeah, that's a good Cameron question. Cameron, how do you do the things that you do? How did you learn to do that?
I think there's a mixture. So two-part answer to this. On the one hand, there are any number of blog posts, like Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug is a classic, and articles that you could look at formally. But I think the thing that I keep coming back to is paying attention to what things do I see in the world that catch my attention. And I don't limit this to websites. So you look at what artists are doing, what people in movies are doing, what people in commercials are doing that draw your attention. And these are pretty fundamental things, like your eye is drawn to wiggles. You can look at the cognitive science of visual perception. There's all these things about like Gestalt effects, or what colors people respond to. You see it in our slides. We mute out the things we don't want you to pay as much attention to, and we bold the things that are most important at any given point. I would say that the overarching theme is paying attention to the fact that no matter what you do with the computer, the limiter of people's ability to understand what you're saying is the limit of how much information is jumping out to them in front of their eyes. And anything that you can do to reduce the noisiness of things that aren't important yet and bump up the importance of the things that people need to know right now is going to help. And let's say you have a lot of information and you want to share it gradually, you share it with somebody in stages rather than showing all of it at once. Sometimes if you've been in a problem for a long time, it's easy to forget that what you're showing is actually a lot of things at once. So showing your work to somebody with fresh eyes and attention to where they get hung up will help you to scope down what you're showing to something more digestible so that they're not overwhelmed. And this brings us right back to the straw idea that we've been talking about this whole time.
So kind of, I think it's an interesting thing about teams is when you kind of can be in resonance with somebody, but just a little bit different. The way that I would describe what Cameron just said is the same. We have the same set of values, but I think of it in a little bit less engineering-y way. Like I was an engineer in undergrad, but I've gotten far enough from that the way that I think about these things is kind of the three core values that I apply to most things. That the most important things that we have in life in general are meaningful connections with people, cognitive capacity, which you could also call attention, and the unbelievably limited amount of time that we have in life to distribute between those two things. So everything can be measured in those terms. And whether it's a user coming to your site or being able to see your family at the holidays, the more noise you can remove, the less ink on the page, the fewer distractions from the moments when you're with the people you care about, the better that is. And it's been fun to work with Cameron in terms of the way that we apply those ideas, both to the philosophical design of a thing and to the engineering architecture of it. It's very interesting. So I think we're closing up on the end of time here. I just wanted to give you one more look at the structure of the data straw as we're kind of prototyping it now. I think every project really needs to start with that initial look at mission and ethics, and that has to be the backbone of the entire project from beginning to end. Scoping the communications to your users, the attention that they are willing to give to you, respecting that attention by engineering for engagement and keeping people locked in, and then having a call to action, building that Rob Martin pocket for the lead guitar to come in so that people resonate with what you want them to do and feel motivated to do a thing about it. A lot of people to thank in this. Big for me has been Lindsay Gavin, who was our connection to Dan Ariely and has been my feedback loop for a ton of this stuff, and is kind of that person who, when I put something new out there, knows how to say just the right thing to make me think twice and get it right. Also like to thank the NYC Open Data organizers, volunteers, and participants. This is a tremendous event, and what a neat thing it is to have it kind of global and to be able to talk into it, even though I'm not in New York City right now. The Hopkins CSSE team has really filled a void in terms of getting COVID data together and then not holding it close to their chest, but releasing it on GitHub for everybody. That is heroic work in this pandemic, and I don't think they get enough credit for it. I'd like to thank everybody who gave us feedback and kind of kicked us around on COVID commitment to help get it right. And Cameron's collaborators on NYC vaccine list. Cam, you want to just list off who you worked with on that?
Yeah, there are so many different people, but especially Dan, Michael, Graham, Carolyn, people who are in there every day, keeping the data up to date. It's not a script that you just kick back and you're done. It's something that we monitor the data quality and update the information every single day. So really a team effort there.
And last but not least, our good friend Rob Martin, who supplied the music for today, and really that kind of inspirational idea of the way that all these pieces come together to make something that you can move with, that you can remember, and that in the end gives you that pocket to ask somebody to do something, to move them emotionally to take the action that you need them to take for the mission that you've set. It's been a great event. It's been great to talk with you. Really appreciate everybody taking the time on a Saturday morning to talk about the geekery that we love. It would mean a lot to us if you'd take the survey to kind of let us know how we did on this and maybe ways that we can improve the next time we give a talk like this. And if you're interested, pop onto the link to join the Data Straw community as we kind of talk through how to flesh this idea out and expand it and make it better. Again, thanks very much, and I hope everybody has a great Saturday.